Missed for those young and young at heart. Good morning, everybody. Take a guess where we're at this morning. We are once again still in the book of Acts, entering into our 10th message on the book of Acts. Don't worry, we only have 2 more. I promise there's only 2 more. I will wrap up Acts within the next 2 weeks, and then we will move on to the book of Romans. Because, it's Acts and then Romans, so it just logically makes sense. So 2 more weeks in Acts, and then I promise we will be away from Acts for at least a little bit. This morning we're going to be in Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. This is nearing the end of Paul's second missionary journey. If we remember back to the first missionary journey, it was Paul with the jailer and the demon-possessed girl and also the jailer and Lydia. And we talked about the aspects of those 3 people being very different parts of life and how we reach those people. Because it's easy to reach the people that are the Lydias in life, but how do we reach those who are, demon-possessed? Or reach the people who don't necessarily find a reason to believe? And so that's what we talked about in Paul's kind of first missionary journey. This is the end of Paul's second. And then Paul will go on to a third, and we'll get to that in the next 2 weeks here. But if we look at where Paul is at now, he's in Corinth. He's in Corinth. And if I put a map up here, it wouldn't do very much good because none of us really know much about the map of Greece unless we've studied, geography of the area. But if we picture Athens in the center of Greece, and then there's the shore about 50 miles or so west of that. If we come down a little bit south from that, then there's this little bridge of land that connects to a larger area of Greece. Now, if you remember back from your geography classes in school, that little strip of land is called an isthmus. An isthmus, which isn't as easy as it is to say. Now, isthmus. Now, if you look at this isthmus, it is only 3.5 miles wide. On one side, you have basically the Ionian Sea. And then on the other side, you have the Aegean Sea. Now, if people on the east coast of Greece want to get to the west coast of Greece, it is actually a lot quicker to come around to where Corinth is, other than going the extra 200 miles to get to the west coast or even off to Rome or Italy. That is the easiest way to get there. But it's an isthmus, and so that means it's land. There is no water on either side of Corinth. And so actually these men, once they got to the port, they would actually unload all the cargo, pull the ship out of the water, put the ship on rollers, and then roll it the 3.5 miles to the other side of Corinth. That was actually easier than going the 200 miles around. It's interesting to me that a ship ends up getting pulled out of water and pulled across the land to other water. And that was easier. Now you would think, well, why didn't they just dig a canal? Why didn't they just connect the water? Well, if we look at the geography of that area of Greece, it is mostly rocky, mountainous terrain. Now this canal was started by Nero. That name should sound familiar. The narcissist that Nero wanted to take this on. And so it started with Nero in around 67, 65 AD. So roughly 30 years after Jesus, when Nero came to power, that's when Nero started this. That same canal, remember this is only 3.5 miles wide, that same canal wasn't finished until 1893. 1893. And so none of these people during Paul's day that we'll talk about today ever saw this canal come to completion. But you can imagine if this was the easiest way to connect the east from the west, that this place saw a lot of people. And now if we know much about Athens, And if you think Athens, you should think philosophers and scholars and education and other things like that. In fact, it was home to one of the most academic places, and you think of Aristotle and Plato and minds like that come up. And yet, Paul was already there. Paul was there and reached those people. Now, as much as Athens was to education, Corinth was to, well, other things. They had their athletes. In fact, I mentioned the Isthmus before because the Isthmian Games, which is even harder to say than Isthmus, but the Isthmian Games was only rivaled by the Olympic Games. So it was kind of those two huge events, those two huge tournaments to show off athletes. And so Corinth was home of that. Corinth was also home of a very large bronze industry. A very large bronze industry. In fact, if you look at the Temple of Jerusalem, originally it had these doors on the front of it that were 25 feet tall, made of bronze. In fact, these bronze doors would have come from Corinth. And also, if you know today, there's what's called in architecture Corinthian pillars. You know, it's these houses with these huge pillars in the front of them. Those are Corinthian pillars. And so you have these examples of the good things that come from Corinth. However, you also have the debauchery and the sex trade and everything else that comes with living in the port city of Corinthia, or from Corinth. Now, certain towns get certain attributes attributed to them, or certain phrases attributed to them, certain trademarks, if you will, attributed to them. Now, when I lived in West Virginia, we always made fun of West Virginia's slogan because it was open for business. That was West Virginia's slogan. What's that even mean, that West Virginia is open for business? No one closed West Virginia. In fact, most of the state's not even filled with any businesses or any people. So what are they open for business for? But you have all these places. And it was actually said about Corinth, a poor man can't live in Corinth, because the amount of stuff that was there to acquire, whether it be physical or material. And so I bring all of this up because this is going to play into our story here. Now, when we first start into chapter 18, we'll meet a couple named Priscilla and Aquila. It's a good thing that it says this couple's married, because otherwise you may think they were twins with those names, where you have people naming twins like Jake and Blake, or Eric and Derek, or Addison and Madison, or Haley and Kaylee. I don't know why people do that to kids, those poor kids. And so it's easy to see, it's a good thing that Aquila and Priscilla are mentioned as husband and wife. It also mentions here that they left from Italy. I want to explain this before I got into it, otherwise I'd probably forget. They left Italy. Back before this happened, back before Paul took his leave here on his missionary journeys, there was an outbreak. There was a riot in Rome. And the emperor at the time, during this riot, instead of finding who was at fault or punishing whoever was responsible for this riot, he ended up just telling all of the Jews to leave. He kicked out all the Jews out of Rome. And because of that, you have one of the first Jewish diasporas, which means them leaving a place. This is one of the first times in more modern history of the Jews being kicked out of a place. Now, we have the Old Testament, which tells us of them getting kicked out all over the place. But this is one of the first times in the New Testament, within more modern terms, of the Jews getting kicked out of a city. And so this is how Aquila and Priscilla come to Corinth. And here we'll meet Aquila and Priscilla. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them. And because he was the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade the Greeks. Now, it's funny, if this riot started in Rome, why did the Jews all get kicked out? Well, the biggest factor of this riot in Rome and why Claudius kicked out the Jews was, if you read into outside historical documents other than the Bible, it's actually mentioned that this riot was brought about by a man named Christus. Christus. Now, that name in Greek isn't exactly the name Christ or Christus. It sounds a little bit different, and so it's actually thought that this was a mistranslation of the name, that you hear this name and they mistranslated it, and they don't really put much emphasis on who this was because, well, it was just another person causing rebels to riot. But it's actually thought that this Christus was Christus, or Jesus Christ. And so you have the people following Jesus, and you have the original Jews who are going back and forth. As much we read about through the book of Acts of these Jews and new Christians going back and forth. And so that's why you have this big movement of the Jews out of Rome. And if we look at this, it mentions here that Paul was a tent maker. It's most likely when Paul was on his way from Athens to Corinth, or maybe even a little sooner, that he had some kind of connection to someone in Corinth who would connect them together. And so he didn't just show up to Corinth saying, hey, anybody a tent maker? So it's most likely that he had some kind of connection beforehand and got into contact with Priscilla and Aquila. In fact, if we look at Old Testament or New Testament churches, or Old Testament churches, in the synagogue, it was segregated seating. And so you had the men on one side, you had women on the other side. But on top of that, the men also sat with whichever guild they were from, meaning whatever job they had, they would sit within that group. So if you're new in that city, you would know, oh, well, this is the group of tent makers. This is the group of blacksmiths. This is the group of people who thatch roofs. I don't know if they thatched roofs in Corinth or if they... No, that's something else for another time. But so regardless, if Paul went into the city, he would know where he was supposed to sit within the synagogue, get connected with those people. Now, it's interesting, wherever Paul went, now we know Paul was a Pharisee, and so Paul was very well educated. Paul would speak within the synagogue. Paul was a leader within the synagogue. Isn't Paul supposed to be paid by the church? Well, your home church, yes, but he was on mission. He was going out into the world. And so from a very young age, the Jewish men would learn a trade on top of what they learned in the Hebrew school. They learned a trade so that whenever they went anywhere, they would be able to work in order to raise money. They didn't have to depend on the help of others, on those around them, on the city they were going into. They didn't have to depend on that. They didn't have to put them out trying to raise extra money. And so it's interesting here that Paul, from a young age, learning tent making or leather working, because tents aren't made from the nylon and polyester and whatever else they're made from today. They were made from animal hides. And so Paul not only made tents, he would have had to be able to work with leather. And so you have Paul here working with leather in order to make these tents. And so because Paul worked with these tents, he was able to help Aquila and Priscilla in their tent making. And so the only room he took up was just a bed to sleep in. Other than that, Paul took care of everything else and made his own money that way. And so that brings me to a question. How do we respond in life with that? When we go into some place, do we take up more room than necessary? Or are we equipped to blend into a community? If we go in as Christians to a place, do we expect things because we're Christian? Or do you go in prepared to kind of blend into the community, to better the community? Because in one attribute helps the community, another attribute it hinders the community. As we move on here, we meet the Jews that Paul gets confronted by, because everywhere Paul goes, Paul gets confronted by the Jews, whether it be from the circumcision that we talked about a couple weeks ago to his stoning that we kind of glossed over a little bit. Everywhere Paul went, Paul was met with opposition. How many times have you gone someplace and met opposition, or met someone who opposed you, or someone who didn't agree with you? It gets tiring, doesn't it? It just wears on you. I remember when I worked at the hardware store, I won't mention his name, but I worked with this other guy, and we would help with deliveries. And so you can imagine driving around Amish countryside delivering refrigerators. We're out there for a long amount of time. And he was one of those guys who just constantly talked about politics. I am one of those guys who constantly goes against talking about politics. And so I would sit there and nod my head. I would nod my head and nod my head. I think mainly to keep myself from falling asleep. But regardless, I was there, confronted with all of this. Even though these weren't my views, it got tiring. Because I'm thinking of all these things in my head that I would like to say to him, but I know in order to keep the workplace cordial, I probably shouldn't say. Especially since this was before I got into ministry, or before thinking about getting into ministry, so maybe the things were nicer left unsaid. But it grates on you. And I can't imagine, because no one was coming after me personally. No one was chasing me. No one was attacking me. No one was looking to stone me. In fact, earlier in one of Paul's missionary journeys, he was stoned to the point where the crowd thought he was dead. And then they left him. And then Paul got up, brushed himself off, walked back into Jerusalem to the rest of the disciples, and cleaned himself up. I can't imagine how tiring being chased everywhere. If we look at the map of where Paul went, it was all the way from Greece all the way to what is the edges of China. Paul went a great distance and was not well received in many places. And Paul is still human. As much as we place Paul on this pedestal as one of the greatest authors of the New Testament, as almost a religious superhero, if you will, Paul's still human, and Paul will still get tired. And Paul getting confronted by the Jews here, it's more discouraging to him this time as he gets on in his travels. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. It's interesting here. There's a phrase in here that says, "Your blood be on your own heads." This should sound fairly familiar. This should kind of throw you back to the scene of Jesus before Pilate. Of Pilate announcing to the Jews, "What do you want done with this man?" And the crowd responds with, "Crucify him." And then there's a shout from the audience that says, "Let his blood be on our hands." Basically, what Paul is doing here is washing his hands of the situation. Paul shook out his garments. Now, it was custom whenever a Jew comes into presence of Holy Land or a synagogue or into another house of a Jew, they would take off their shoes and then shake off the dust as to not bring in unclean dust, whatever clean dust may be. But they would shake out their shoes in order to not bring in from wherever they came from. So Paul here takes it a step further and not only shakes out his shoes, but shakes out his whole tunic, his whole robe that he is wearing. He shakes this off, basically kind of signifying that the dust brought in by this synagogue, the dust that these people are spewing at him, he is not responsible for any of it. He has told them about the gospel. He has told them about Jesus. He has told them everything he can tell them, and still they oppose him. And so he's basically just had enough. He can't do it anymore. And so he just leaves. So for weeks after teaching on the Sabbath, week after week, he just quits, and he goes to this house of this man, Titus Justus. And so there he begins preaching again to the people. This brings us to the next point where God actually comes and comforts Paul. It's interesting that he does it here. It wasn't when Paul was stoned. It wasn't when Paul rebuked the demon-possessed girl. It wasn't on the road to Damascus when Paul first received the voice of God. It was here. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. For I have many in this city who are my people." And he stayed 1 year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. Now, if we go back to the history of Corinth, Corinth was actually a larger city at the time than Athens. Although Athens gets all of the glory, it was about 20 times larger than Athens. It's estimated at this time there was roughly 200,000 people living within Corinth. And Paul says it here. He says, "I'm no longer dealing with you people. I'm going to take the word to the Gentiles." And so Paul takes the word to the Gentiles. And because of that, more Gentiles were baptized and brought into the covenant as believers. Paul was having more success out of the Jewish church. Now, remember when I said about the Bronze Age, the bronze industry within Corinth? This is where this starts coming into effect. Now, notice here, God says, go on speaking, go on doing these things. Corinth and Athens and Greece, you could go today and still see the ruins of all these temples, of all these different gods. In fact, if you go to Rome, you can still see the same thing today. Now you see, it's kind of funny that there's some, in one of the temples in Athens, there's all these gods. There's this god of love, there's the god of the earth, there's the goddess Athena, you have Aphrodite, you have Hermes, you have all these different gods. And then there was this other spot in the temple reserved for the unknown God. So they have all these statues commemorating all these different gods, and they're like, well, we'll put this one in case we forgot one. And Paul, as he goes through this church, he says, I know who this unknown one is. This unknown one is the ruler of all of them. This unknown one is nothing compared to, or is everything compared to these others. And so that is, this God of gods is the one promising comfort. Because he has reached all these people, he will be comforted by all of these people. And these connections actually help in this next story. Paul before the tribunal, verses 12 through 17. But when Gaius was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought before him the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gaius said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And he drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized Sosthenes, ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gaius paid no attention to any of this. So basically, this is the judge of Corinth. The judge of Corinth. The Jews within the synagogue bring Paul to this courtroom. They say, this man is spreading false witness. Once again, we have false witnesses coming forward to try to persuade these men to death. But I also mentioned Paul making connections with the people within the community who weren't necessarily Jewish. This man isn't a Jewish man. In fact, this man is a Gentile and should have no connection at all whatsoever to Paul. But because of the spread of the gospel, he saw Paul's side of this. And he tells the Jews that this isn't in my jurisdiction. This isn't a violent crime. He isn't doing anything against the people of Greece. This isn't what I'm supposed to do, which should remind you a little bit of what Pilate was dealing with. And so because there was no violence for the judge to basically judge on, the Jews went to their synagogue, grabbed the leader of the synagogue, beat him to try to get in front of the judge. What does this say to us? what does this tell us here? People will try to do anything to dissuade us from being Christian, from professing the name of Jesus. People will do anything. They will attack anyone. It doesn't have to be a direct attack on you or your character or who you are as a person. It could be someone you know, someone you love, someone you care about. But you see, we should still be going into the world as Christians, declaring our Christendom, if you will, to the world. They should know we are Christians, but they shouldn't feel that we are Christians. They shouldn't feel burdened by that. They should almost feel accepted by that. You see, the Jews, who should have been the easiest ones to accept Christ because they had the Old Testament, they had the documents that they had learned since they were young, they went to the Sabbath, they celebrated the Sabbath in the synagogue every week. They should have known, and yet they refused. They refused what they shouldn't have known. And yet these Gentiles, much like the 3 Gentiles we talked about in chapter 16, had an easier time accepting than the Jews of the time. So is anybody else tired of being Christian? Of trying to be sinless, of trying to be blameless, of trying to live up to the expectations of the world? Because for some reason there's this feeling outside the church that I'm not going into the church because the people in the church feel like they have it all together, have it all figured out. When in reality, it isn't the healthy people that go to the hospital, it's the sick people. It's not the perfectly saved, sinless people that go to a church, it's the lost. It's the sinners. It's much of the people of Corinth that were those people living in debauchery and sinful lives. I'm going to have Ann come back up, and we're going to our time of invitation. I want you to focus on verse 9. Focus on verse 9. I'll actually go back to it here. That's the wrong direction. And the Lord said to Paul, the Lord says to us, the Lord says to each of us, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. Maybe in that truck I should have been a better witness of what Christ would have offered instead of my own thoughts on the matter. But looking back on it, hindsight's 20/20, isn't it? For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. Now, we don't receive that promise in this situation because this one is specific to Paul himself. But we do receive the gift of eternity as long as we believe. And the gift of eternity in heaven with Jesus sounds a lot better than being persecuted day after day after day, as Paul was. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you for your Son. We thank you for the sacrifice that he made. But more than that, we thank you for the fact that he is a risen Savior. And that because of that, we have the power to go into the world with the Holy Spirit, not to change the world completely, not to burden the world, but to add to the world. To go forward as Paul did. To live a life that speaks to those who are lost. Lord, may we be that beacon to this world. May we be able to go into the world and speak to the lost so that may find you. Lord, that is our prayer in this moment, in this day. It's in Jesus' name I pray.